All right, welcome everybody to week 2 of CSC 744. This week we'll continue to talk about management, leadership, and different approaches we can take in dealing with teams. I'm going to loosely be following out of the chapters of the Managing the Unmanageable, so one of the optional textbooks that we have for the semester. I still don't think you necessarily need to buy it, just more as a resource if you find the information that we're talking about useful or you think would be helpful. I'm certainly not covering everything out of that book or out of the chapters, just using it more or less as a rough guide to provide some cohesion to what we're talking about. So definitely there as a good resource. I won't use it for any sort of assessments, exams, or quizzes, or projects or anything, so you don't have to worry about it there. When we do come up to our first assignment, it'll be independent of the book, at least for the first 1 or 2 assignments here. More to come on those later. Don't expect anything this week, probably next week or maybe even the week after that. Some of the challenges that we'll have with the course here are just that I really had anticipated this having a larger on-campus component and making it more of a group discussion type of a course and not so much of a lecture. And so we'll have a little bit of challenge here as I try to capture or recreate that discussion in the online environment. Obviously that is a challenge, and it sometimes can be limited how effective it can be, and sometimes it can work out really well. And so to try to get that ball rolling here, I am going to create a little more structure to our discussion boards. Again, just to reiterate what we talked about last week, we can provide a lot of experience and insight learning from each other. And so I don't want to be the only one contributing to the course. I'll let you guys do that as well. So anything that you have in here, please feel free that one, that you share it and you're comfortable with the group knowing it, and 2, that someone hopefully can elicit some conversation based off of what you've responded to. I'll jump in as well and add my own thoughts and maybe further question what you're saying, or ask questions based off of what you said to keep that or really build on the discussion. So what you'll see here moving forward is the discussions will become a small-ish portion of the grade. I'll be a little bit clearer about that once I have it completely defined and get that posted as a news item in D2L so you can see that. I'm going to set due dates, otherwise we're just there. I know how it is when you're busy working. It's easy to kind of push this stuff off, especially if my expectations aren't clear, and that is that there's no due date assigned to it. So for week 1, if you could get in there, and I'll set a due date to that as well. So get in there and answer those questions, and then week 2 as well. You'll see that I'd like to see something posted by this Sunday. It's easy to look at timestamps, so that'll be kind of the key indicator there for whether or not you met that. And there's really no right or wrong answers for these, but I'm trying to pose the questions in a way that will just elicit conversation. So read those and provide a subjective response based off of your experience or your interpretation of what we've covered and what I'm asking. So as normal, if there are any issues getting into here and actually leaving discussion items, please let me know right away so I can get them resolved. D2L has gone through a bunch of changes, and so things are just a little bit different than they were even this summer and especially in the last year. So it's possible I set something up wrong and I just didn't realize it. So let me know and I can get that cleared up right away. So that's it so far for our D2L site. I will get a news item posted as well to not only capture that expectation with the discussion, but then also lay out what I'm thinking for this week, and so any expectations there, so that hopefully it's clear and you guys don't have any questions about that. As normal though, if you do have questions, let me know. Reach out to me either through the discussion board or an email. Send me an email, that'd be the best, that's something I monitor and can respond to the quickest. I do have an office phone, but I just haven't updated yet because I'm not even sure what it is. It's a new office and then a new phone. One other thing I do want to I guess let you guys know is that I will start my online office hours this week. That means I'll be online through Google Hangout from 7 to 9 on Thursday nights at 7 to 9 Central, just in case you're not in the same time zone. So if you have anything you'd like to just talk to me about, whether it's the material or the course or just my thoughts on something, please, that would be a great time to jump in there and ask. It's going to be a Google Hangout. It's going to be open to my other classes as well. So if you want it to be more private, then you just need to let me know and we can take it offline. Either find a different time or I can leave that one temporarily. So just let me know what you think and if that would be of use to you. Okay, so before we jump into the material, I wanted to take a look at something that happens to me a surprising amount throughout the years that I've programmed. This is going to be some code that I have committed into GitHub. If you're not familiar with Git or GitHub, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on reviewing it. Bottom line with Git is a way to version our code. It's a version control tool. So if you're using something like TFS or SVN or CVS or I can't even think, there's a handful of other ones. This is a very similar tool. It has a slightly different approach and a lot of benefits to it, which is why one reason I like to use it. I almost use it exclusively. In any place that I go where I have the control to implement something, the version and control, I opt to go with Git, assuming there isn't a better reason not to. We'll get into workflows, project management workflows a little bit later this semester, and with that we'll talk about some of these, Git in particular, because it does facilitate a pretty robust continuous release, continuous development, rapid release, however you want to look at it, workflow. Okay, and I like it for that. But and then GitHub, to finish that thought, GitHub then is actually just an online way of sharing the code. So with Git, just like with any other version and control software, you create a repository and you check in and check out code. GitHub then just does that for you online. So you can have a combination of private and public repositories, and you can now push code, commit code, pull it down to this public repository. So it can become your central clearinghouse for your code, more or less. What you have here then is just a small program. It's just some Windows API programming that I tinker around with every once in a while, and use them for my own personal interest, and then also I use them for some of my examples in some of the C programming classes. I have some other friends and faculty that look at this or that can use this. What this is then, someone did that. They take a look at the code and they proposed a new change. And this is the diff between my original code, which is going to be the red, the deletions, and the green, which is going to be what they're proposing the changes are, the amended changes. So, red is what they took away, green is what they've added. And if you look at this, you can see it's more or less trivial, right? It's kind of a silly example because there really is no net difference in the change in the program. The reason I bring this up is that this type of thing happens very frequently, and I've been in many code reviews and many team meetings where something innocuous as this turns into a very big deal on the development team. So what was the change here? Well, if we look at this red line of code, you can see that there's an if statement, there's a function call to this connect, a bunch of different variables here, and then the result, the return result of that function is compared to 0. If it was not equal to 0, then we if connect, sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought. If it's not equal to 0, then we enter into that branch and we say that it's unable to connect, return 1. If it is equal to 0, then we move on. So that's saying that if we don't establish, this is for a TCP connection. So if we don't establish a connection, we just print off that we didn't, and then we kill the program, return 1. If we did, then we're good to go, and program execution could continue. So what do you need to do here? You need to be able to understand this function call, which is our connect call, as well as all the arguments, as well as this return type, in order to completely evaluate this. What was the change that was made? Well, the change made was, let's pull this function call out, let's assign the return value to a variable, and now let's do a comparison on the variable itself. Okay, so again, the net program didn't change, except we have one additional variable that we didn't have. But the person that proposed the changes does not like this. They think that's a terrible way to code, and this is the way to go, that this makes it more readable, more maintainable. I disagree, but I went ahead and included it because with this program it doesn't matter a whole lot to me. Programmers tend to be very opinionated when it comes to these things, these different styles, and that's all these are. These are styles. I think you could argue, I could argue that this is less efficient because we're wasting more memory. There's 4 bytes for an int, and we're now wasting 4 bytes to store it just to simply compare the results here. Either way, you have to understand what the function does and what it returns in order to evaluate this condition. But they think that this is more readable. So how do we manage this in a team environment? And probably the easiest or best thing we can do is, one, to create an environment where our developers are free to choose the style that they like, and in code reviewing, just train them not to pick up on this. Who cares? Does it do the same thing? It's your style versus my style. Leave it alone. I can live with your style, you can live with mine. if it's significant enough impact on the code, then it needs to be identified, addressed, and resolved. So, the other thing we can do is when we're in a position of leadership or in a position of management. I had bosses. I had a particular manager this would happen. He would do this very frequently with me. That is that how I felt was he would be consistently pushing his style of coding on me, and not actually changes that were, of a benefit to the program itself. So here I was forced to adopt his style and not changes that actually made the code better. So, we as managers, we need to identify when we're doing that to our team members, to our employees, and then when they're doing it to other coders, because it can get very frustrating if you feel like your code is constantly being criticized, especially when you just can't see a very big change in it. Of course, if you guys can see something in here where one way would be better than the other, love to hear it. Put it in the discussion board, or send me an email. We can certainly talk about it. But again, it's hard. We're managing and dealing with styles and individual personalities, and so it's just really hard sometimes to manage these really weird nitnoid things to make sure that they don't cause a lot of disruption and disunity on the team. So, again, as a manager, I'd say for the most part, if my approach is kind of lackadaisical in this sense, and that I'm not going to beat somebody up over it, if to me the code is still sound, it's still structured well, and it's just a minor style change, I'd rather adopt it than cause tension between the team members. But again, when you're in that position of leadership, it's up to you to set the expectation and set the standard. You could go the other way, and you could always be telling people this is the style you're going to adopt. And you'll eventually get to a point where they'll write code that looks like this instead of writing code that looks like this. And eventually you won't have to deal with it. But as with a lot of these topics we're going to talk about, it becomes an art form. It becomes very subjective and situation dependent. And so it's hard to say, do it this way over this way. Okay, so that was just my one code sample. I didn't want us to go too far into the semester here without looking at least a little bit of code. From there, I'll move us back into the slides, if I can find them. Okay, so we'll take a look at what I'm going to consider effective management, and that is some things to think about, some tools that we can add to our belt in order to become effective managers. I'm just going to get a quick check on the time. I think I can do that. Maybe not. Okay, so I try to keep this relatively short, that 20 to 30 minutes or so. So we'll talk about some of these topics, and as I just mentioned here a couple of minutes ago, we're still in this land where it's hard to give absolute checklists or procedures for doing things. We're at the end of the day, at the bottom line here, we're dealing with individuals, with people, and as such, there is no right fit for every single individual. So it all comes down to understanding your team, understanding your people, and learning to manage them effectively. Now, there's some things we can talk about, big picture, that should help along the way, and that's what I'm going to try to do with the next few slides here, is outlining them. All right, there's a couple approaches that we need. All right, I'm going to go back to this size screen. I don't have my screen recording full size, so I'm afraid I'm going to cut that off. There's a couple different approaches that we can generally look at when we look at management. Managing down, managing up, managing out, and managing yourself. The first one is probably the most important because it's going to be the one that you spend the most amount of time in. Now, whether you call it managing down or not, that's no big deal. But the idea is that you're managing those that report directly or indirectly to you. Managing up, how do you manage the perception of your team outside of the team itself? Managing out, how do you manage those that work with you or next to you? And then, of course, managing yourself, because it's important that while we're doing all this managing, talk about all this managing, we don't forget ourselves. This next few slides will just focus on managing down. And then the second lecture this week, we'll talk about up, out, and yourself. So I said that managing down is where you'll spend the bulk of your time, and that's managing your programs. Those that report directly to you. Okay, so they work for the same company, they derive a paycheck from the same place, and you are considered their boss. And with that, there comes a lot of expectation. There's some that can be indirectly to you, and this one gets to be a little bit more of a gray area. I can think of a couple of outside the the organization relationships, such as a contractor. Contractor coming in where he doesn't necessarily report to you, but he's going to report or work with you for his tenure while they're with the organization. So that's something that I would consider an example, kind of loose anyway, for an indirect report. Managing your programmers is going to be the biggest day-to-day activity that you'll have, because they are the ones that you are going to ultimately be responsible for making sure that what you are tasked to do gets accomplished. And so knowing what they're up to on a day-to-day basis becomes critical. It becomes a big challenge because there is a tendency to want to micro or macro manage. That is that you want to have such a fine, granular level of control over your entire team, so you know what's going on, that you're controlling what they do day to day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute. However, can get very granular. That can be very difficult for your team to work under, especially with those higher level, higher performing employees, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. Let's see. So when we talk about managing our own team, our own employees, and I'll try to use I'll probably use the word team and employees a little bit interchangeably here. I talked a little bit about this last week, and that is earning technical respect, and it becomes a very critical concept, a very critical component of your management. Now that we're talking about managing down, managing the actual employees, what do they see when they look up to you? So not every manager needs to be a technical expert in order to manage a team of developers, but it's pretty rare that you find someone that doesn't have a technical background that can effectively manage technical people, programmers. And so earning technical respect becomes very, very important. A good example of this is the PHB, or the pointy-haired boss. If you're a Dilbert fan, you know probably him well. I'm not a huge Dilbert fan, but because the book brought it up, I actually looked into it a little bit more, and it did seem to kind of encapsulate everything that I've known or thought of as a stereotype when it comes to essentially what is a bad manager. So there you can see a little cartoon plus the inset on the right here. This guy here is our pointy-haired boss. And what does he epitomize? He epitomizes the boss that doesn't have the technical knowledge or technical know-how in order to actually manage a team of developers or professionals. He doesn't really seem to care. He doesn't take the time to get to know them, what they do, to understand their jobs, what they need to do their jobs well, and then providing and cultivating an environment for them to do that. And he almost seems dangerous or malicious in his approach to management, and that the team is often left feeling like they need to work around him or in spite of him instead of with him and for him. Another good example that comes to mind, and maybe this one's a little more relevant, is The Office and the Michael Scott, or at least what was the Michael Scott character. I guess it's been a little bit since he's been on the show now. Same kind of concept. He comes across as he's almost so incompetent, he's dangerous, and people tend to find out ways and figure out ways to work around him to accomplish their job and still achieve a level of success. Now, I don't think anybody strives to be that kind of boss, and so this is taking it to the extreme for an example, but it does talk about the technical credit, and that is that with this pointy-haired boss, this guy at Dilbert, not only does he not possess it, he doesn't care to possess it. He doesn't care to understand his employees. And so whether or not you're developing, you're leading a team, and you guys are working in the technology that maybe you came up through the ranks learning, or it's something that you got brought on to the team as an expert already, it's important to continue to try to earn that and understand what your developers are up to. So technical respect, let's jump ahead here. Is something that is earned. There's a variety of things that we'll talk about here on the next slide and how you earn that. Without it, we risk a couple of things. We risk a variety of things, but there's some things that we're particularly concerned about. That is that we can create an environment, as I just talked about, where the programmers fear that you'll just mess it up due to lack of understanding, lack of caring, lack of competence, etc. And the worst thing that can happen is that the team develops this fear, and then they actually work either actively or passively to subvert your efforts. They start working around you. Now you're creating a team or an environment that is, becoming very dangerous, and ultimately you, the team, and maybe even the organization could possibly fail. So how do we prevent this from happening? Well, these are going to come straight out of your book because they're all really good points. How do you earn technical respect? Well, since we're talking about programming, learning the art of programming, that's probably the number one thing you can do. So oftentimes you'll see, I've seen it, it's been my experience, that most programmers that become managers, they work their way up. They work at a company, they put in a lot of time there, and they show that they have the technical respect from their peers by being part of large projects, being successful, being reliable, all those things that makes a manager, a good programmer, a good programmer. Learning the art of programming, then, they learn along the way. So it's not something that someone that lacks, again, it's not necessarily a requisite, but you'll find it, I think, very challenging if you don't understand programming to manage a bunch of programmers. Having a good track record kind of ties into what I just said. Being accountable and responsible, being, demonstrating the ability to communicate well with others, and then having successful projects. Oftentimes you'll see that your success, no matter how good you are, is measured by the things that you've been able to accomplish as a professional. Making notable technical contributions. Okay, this can be a wide variety of things. Personally, I contribute, or I try to contribute, to open source projects in a variety of ways, whether it's doing some security research here and there, or contributing to documentation. I'm currently working on the OWASP code review documentation or standards. So, that's something that helps to add to my technical credit as I demonstrate the ability to clearly define policies and procedures at a management level that my team could look up to, or that I could implement for my team. Keeping up with trends in tech, that's going to be a big one, and that nobody wants to work for a company that isn't keeping up. Nobody wants to work for someone, well, I shouldn't say that nobody, but it's more difficult, I think, to work for someone that just isn't keeping up or doesn't seem to care. Technology people tend to like technology. They tend to like staying on the cutting edge and not getting stale with their skills and how technology is evolving. And so it's important for us as managers, as leaders, to stay on top of that, to not know every single thing that's going on in excruciating level of detail, but understand big picture trends, and I think most importantly, be able to identify when technology is making a fundamental shift so that your company is not left behind. I've done some work in the area here for a rather large company that built an entire infrastructure on Cold Fusion, and now Cold Fusion is, at least in my perspective, is almost an all but dead language, and here they are still on this to this day on a Cold Fusion infrastructure. They should have made this shift a long time ago, and so their leadership just they didn't see it, or they chose to ignore it, or maybe they have some really sound reasoning to stay on it. I'm not here to judge or criticize, but it just doesn't seem like a good place to be right now. Active members of professional groups. Okay, so there's a lot of them out there, and from these national or international organizations such as OWASP, ACM, or IEEE, to local development groups. I know in the Madison, Sioux Falls is a large city of the South, large-ish anyway, relatively speaking, for South Dakota terms. All sorts of professional groups there that are just regional groups or groups native to Sioux Falls, but groups that allow developers to get together and talk about technology, to keep themselves up to date, keep them up with trends in tech, and then also to present or become active leaders in kind of forging ahead themselves as an expert in a particular area. Demonstrating strong personal values. Yep, I think so. That we always want to do that. That's just good management. Working your way up. Okay, I've kind of alluded to it here and there as we've talked today, but oftentimes you'll have managers that start off as the programmer 1, programmer 2, programmer 3, or entry, mid, senior programmer, and then they get a position or an opportunity to become the manager. And so that builds with them a lot of credit because they've been in the organization for a long time. They've, I guess in a way you could say, they've paid their dues, and that by that point in time, they've put in, let's just say, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years. They demonstrated their ability to code. They wouldn't be coding that long if they weren't at least moderately good at it. and they understand the organization. So that helps a lot as well. And then, as I mentioned, successful projects. So a lot of success is going to be measured in looking at successful projects. Think about it from the perspective when you apply for a company. What is, at least for me, again, my experience has been that one of the first few things that is asked of me when I interview or when I'm talking to someone that's I'm going to potentially do work for is, what other work have you done? Can I see an example of it? Because that seeing samples of my work, seeing successful project completion, it says a lot about someone, and it gives somebody something to look at to try to get an idea, taking that very abstract notion of you as a person and making it a little bit more concrete. And it's no different with building that technical credit. What projects have you been involved on, and have they been successful? Because if you come into an organization as a manager and you've been a part of 3 or 4 failed startups, and you've been fired from your last 2 jobs, well, one, you got to question the hiring there. But two, that impression when the team members find out about it, depending on the situation, the circumstances, it might not be. It might be hard to create a good environment there. Technical credit. Okay, so we'll wrap that up. Basically, can you have, do you have the background, and can you have a technical conversation with your staff? Can you walk into their cube, walk into a team meeting, and discuss the project at a technical level where you understand what's going on? And you're going to want to be able to do that. What about certifications? So as far as building your technical credit, do you pursue other certifications? I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, although I do get asked this question a lot. I think certifications is just such a subjective measure for someone, that I've worked for people that only want to hire, or they're looking for must have a certified ethical hacker certification. And then I've also worked for people that couldn't care less. Certifications mean absolutely nothing to them. So it's really going to depend. I think you're going to have to develop your own style on what you think someone possessing that certification brings to the table. Not all certifications are created equal, and so some will carry a very high level of prestige and weight with them and in possessing. So very subjective. I have a certified ethical hacker. It really hasn't helped me, but that's a pretty entry-level certification, so I wasn't really expecting it to be. All your certifications. So you can have all this stuff, you can do all this great stuff, but how do you make it known? And how do you make it known without coming across as being arrogant or conceited or in your face about it? And that, again, that's going to be kind of a challenge. So what you'll typically see is people hanging degrees and certs or publications in an office. That's a pretty good way. It's usually getting the point across without being too in your face about it. Oftentimes, your reputation can precede you, and making sure that it's preceding you in a good way and not a negative way, because your reputation will precede you one way or the other. And again, that's a little bit harder, but typically from your outside involvement, the groups you're involved in, the organizations you're involved in, and the extra work you do, that helps to build overall your technical cred. All right, so I'm going to wrap up the talk about technical cred. The last bullet here I threw on just as a kind of an aside for myself to remind me to talk about it, and that's in working from being promoted from within. Oftentimes this is the case. You get promoted from within because you spent the time, you focused on a position and that pay raise or that promotion, and then you finally achieve it. This can be incredibly awkward because you went from working on a team where you were all peers to working with the same people, but now you're the one that's expected to be in charge. You're the one that's supposed to provide the cohesion, provide the correct environment, do performance reviews, performance feedbacks, discipline when necessary, fire if you have to, and it changes the relationship and it can strain it quite a bit. The most important or the biggest advice I can give in a situation like this, because I went through something very significant like this myself, is to remember that your position has now changed and your job depends on you setting aside those personal relationships and becoming an effective manager and working towards the good of the team, the good of the organization, the good of the projects, over your personal your personal relationships. If that's not something you can do, then you need to be, identify that now and figure out how you're going to handle it if the case ever comes up, if the situation ever arises. And think about it both ways. Okay, think about it if you got that promotion, you got moved into a management position, but then also think about it if the guy, the good friend next to you in the cube next to you, same thing happens to him, and he went from being, one of your buddies on the team to now being the boss. It can change drastically. It can almost be a minor change. It just really depends on how formalized the role is, how big the team, the organization, and how, like I said, how formalized, how defined it is. Okay, let's see. We'll talk a few more minutes here. So managing down. When we take a look at managing down, let's see, hiring. We do need to talk about hiring. I don't have a lot to say here because the book, optional book here, covers it quite a bit, and it's probably not something you're too concerned about right now. You're more worried about managing the existing team. But when you move into that position of leadership, I think one of the first things you need to do is take stock of your team. Figure out if the team is completely new to you, you need to figure out who is in what position and what kind of person are they. What are they responsible for? What kind of effort do they put in? What kind of results do they give? If it's a team you're already familiar with, you probably know that. But now you need to take stock and view those individuals at a much different level because now you're the one in charge. You need to ask yourself if you have the right team, because if you don't, you need to set about building it. Overall, their success is your success, and your job really will depend on it. So, making sure that you have the right team. Now it's about survival, and you want to do the best you can, and you need to have the people in place to help you to do that. Hire great programmers. Of course, that's much easier said than done, and there's a lot of literature out there that will talk you through the process, or you can find a lot of organizations. Again, our book is one example, where people will tell you about their experience from hiring some of the top programmers in the world over the course of decades. It's easier said than done. Check those resources. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it right now. And then keep your team motivated, and just remember, I know I say it entirely too much, but they are individuals, and get to know them on a personal as well as professional level when you're figuring out the composition of the team and the composition of the team that you want. Okay, this will be our last slide, and then I'll wrap up for today. So, we have many different types of programmers, and we talked about this last week, but it's just important to come back and just to reiterate one last time. System programmers, architects, application programmers, database programmers, UI and web developers. And these are very broad categories. Some people will fit the bill in multiple programmer types. Some people will just be in one. And so identifying the roles that you need on your team inside your organization, and then who fits those roles, or do they fit in multiple roles? That's part of that overall evaluation of the team as you're taking over, as you're moving into a management or leadership position. Again, can't group them all by category, and you just oftentimes you do need to, well, you don't oftentimes, you have to take account of the individual themselves. So this is just rough guidelines in order to help figure out what you have and what you need. One thing that we run into danger with is that when people become either stretched too thin because the team is smaller than the roles or responsibilities that they have, or because somebody does just do that one type very well. You have a DBA, and that's what he does. He does it really well, but that's all he does. That's all he thinks. They can get tunnel vision, and they can lose sight of the big picture. So, facilitating communication between the types, identifying them, understanding them, and then making sure that everybody's still seeing that big picture becomes a big role. I think for now we'll wrap it up. As you can see here, I have a handful of slides left just to talk about here later this week. Again, I'll keep it relatively short, as I'd like a chunk of this conversation to move into the discussion forums. If you have any questions on anything I talked about, again, let me know, and I will also get these slides available in D2L. So hope you have a good weekend, and I will talk to you in the next lecture.